Good morning. It is June 26th, and this is Focus on the News. I'm Senator Dick Black, retired senator, and our principal topic, our first topic for the day, is going to be school libraries. A picture is worth 1,000 words, and for that, our guest will be Laura Robinson. Our second topic, which will follow this after Laura has left us, is going to be my assessment of the attempted coup in Russia and the implications of that. So, Laura, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Senator.
We're looking forward to listening to you. Just to brief our listeners, Laura Robinson has a bachelor's and master's degree from Georgetown University. She was with the federal government and retired after 20 years. Wanted to spend more time with her husband and daughter. They hosted fundraisers for a number of charities like the Cancer Foundation. But recently, she became worried about sexually explicit materials in the public schools right here in Loudoun County, Virginia, which was the epicenter of the school uprising. And Laura felt that other parents needed to begin to understand just what those problems were. Because if you read in the media and you look at the bleached out discussions of what's going on, you would get the impression that you have a bunch of rubes here in Loudoun County, a bunch of primitives in what happens to be the county with the highest per capita income in the entire United States, and probably the highest educational level anywhere in the United States. I'm not sure that that's precisely correct, but I know the income level is. And so I asked Laura to read with me a couple of very interesting New York Times articles that were in the paper just within the last couple of days, and there were the second article that we'll talk on a little bit dealt with the plunging scores in reading and math in the public schools, and it's quite a disastrous tale. It's a very good article in the New York Times, but this particular one that I want to go into is a New York Times article entitled, "Everyone Likes Reading. Why Are We So Afraid of It?" And so I guess first I'll begin, Laura, and I'll just let you address things generally, but I'll ask the question, do you think that parents are really afraid of reading? Is that what's going on?
No, Senator. First of all, good morning, and thank you for having me on today. I say parents are not afraid, and I say parents be not afraid, but I say parents be aware. There are books today that are not the books that you and I grew up with. There's no Dick and Jane, there's no Go Dog Go, that was my favorite. Today's books are sexually explicit and they're sexually graphic. Not all of them, certainly, but a subset of them. And some parents, I completely understand, have children who are struggling with gender dysphoria or children who are struggling to determine what their sexual preference is. And for those parents, they may feel that these books are a godsend and they may want to have these books. And I understand that and I respect that. The other side of the coin is there are a number of parents who don't want their children to see these books, who don't want their children to be exposed to these books. Why? Their children may be sensitive. Their children may have been sexually abused and this triggers some trauma in them. their children may be autistic and don't understand what's in these books and then maybe want to mimic the behavior. Or this may simply be a family with conservative cultural and religious values who don't feel it's appropriate. And both sides of this coin need to be understood and need to be respected if we're to come up with any solution to what to do and how to put guardrails on these books.
Okay. Now, I should mention that, again, the title of the New York Times article was "Everyone Likes Reading. Why Are We So Afraid of It?" The author was A.O. Scott, a gentleman who published the article on June the 21st in the New York Times. I just have plucked a couple of comments from his article. At one point he says, a precious domain of imaginative intellectual freedom is menaced by crude authoritarian politics. That sort of triggered a few things in my mind. And so I want to ask you two questions. The first is, do you think parents are menacing a precious domain of imaginative and intellectual freedom? And secondly, do you see them resorting to crude authoritarian politics?
I wish we could have a dialogue in this country where that's about a sensitive issue, where we don't start bringing topics in or rhetoric in like authoritarianism or fascism, because it takes our eye off of the issue. And maybe that's the point. But in this case, the issue is parents having the knowledge of what's in these schools. And let me tell you, Senator Black, none of these books leave anything to the imagination. And I'd like to share my screen with you right now.
Yes, that's fine.
To show you some of these books.
Now bear with us for just a minute. We're going to do a screen share here. So.
Okay. Just give me a minute.
I will point out as you're doing that when the author refers to crude authoritarian politics, the First Amendment of the United States Constitution guarantees the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition their government for redress of grievances. Now, those people who appeared at the school board meetings and were quite emotional, were peaceably assembling. There was no violence. There was no hint of violence. There was no threat of violence. I was there, and I know, and they were there at the invitation of the Loudoun County School Board to petition their government for redress of grievances, as is provided explicitly by the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So, okay, with that, Laura.
Okay. Yes, thank you. So I just have 3 slides I want to show you. And I'm going to go through preschool, elementary school, middle school, high school. So at first glance, this may not seem like any big deal to you. This is just a little cartoon. It comes from a book called What's the Big Secret? And the subtitle is Talking About Sex with Girls and Boys. And on these 2 pages, we have an anatomy of a boy and the anatomy of a girl. But when you think about this, private parts have special names. And what this book is doing is removing that barrier to privacy. So the privacy of a hand is equal to the privacy of a penis. The privacy of an arm is equal to the privacy of a vulva. So it's breaking down some of the social norms of not discussing some of these things publicly. Now, if you're a parent who wants your children to learn these names in preschool, God bless you. That's up to you. Great relationship with your kids. But a parent should be the one to decide if these words are introduced into their children's vocabulary. And by having these books available in the public schools, freely available on the shelves for any child to pick up, whether they meet the ability to be able to understand them and deal with them, that decision has now been taken out of the hands of the parent and put into the hands of the school. And so this is not so innocent anymore. Let me move on to another one. In elementary school, there are dozens of books that have to do with transgenderism and sexuality. So we have many, many books about a boy wanting to be a girl or identifying as a girl or a girl identifying as a boy. And it's shown as very normal and very acceptable. Now, again, if you are a parent of a transgender child, my heart goes out to you, and these books may be helpful to you. But other parents may not want their children exposed to that. And I just think that we need to have some guardrails on these books so that the parent decides what their child is exposed to. Over here on this side, we have something called Pride Puppy. Pride Puppy is for preschoolers. It's a cute little book with wonderful, cheerful graphics that is about a puppy who gets lost during a pride parade. And as he finds his way back, he's learning his ABCs. And for example, we get to Q, and Q is all about a queen prom and about queers. This is for preschool. I don't know that all parents want their children to see this at the preschool or even lower elementary levels. And again, it should be a decision of the parent. Finally, when we get into middle school and high school, these books become far more graphic and far more visually graphic. Just two examples, and these aren't even the worst of them. There's a book called Flamer over here. And it's about basically an abusive father. The father is drinking, the father's masturbating in front of the child. And at one point, the father says he has his Mountain Dew bottle, and he says to the little boy, "We're each busting a load into this bottle. If you don't come, you have to drink it. Ha, ha, ha." And you can see over here, the little boy is terrified as his father comes toward him with this bottle. Doesn't know what to do, I'm sure. Over on this side, we have a book called Dating and Sex, a Guide for the 21st Century Teen Boy. Now, a lot of times parents are accused of wanting to restrict access to these books. They're being accused of being homophobic, anti-transgender, but many of these books have to do with heterosexual sex as well, equally inappropriate at young ages. And this is one of the examples. It says, strictly speaking, you cannot masturbate or jerk off too much. In chapter 6, you'll learn about other problems like rubbing yourself raw. So again, it is not authoritarian to have guardrails to allow parents to determine what they want their children exposed to.
Well, I think anyone reasonable would agree with that. But the author of this article very correctly says that maybe the real problem is that children aren't being taught to read at all. Now, I found it interesting that on the same day that this article was written, the New York Times also carried an article about the plunging academic scores, as we've mentioned before. They wrote, and quote, "The math and reading performance of 13-year-olds in the United States has hit the lowest level in decades, according to test scores released today from the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the gold standard federal exam." So I question you, Laura, could it be that the school's focus on radical sexual and racial theories is distracting from traditional education, the learning of reading, writing, and arithmetic?
Well, I'm not an education specialist, and I think there's probably many reasons that these scores have plummeted. But I will share with you that I did teach school for 3 years. I was a volunteer teacher, and it was during COVID. And I feel that today teachers are being vilified for being lazy and not wanting to teach, and they're being blamed to some extent for these test scores going down. And I can tell you that as a teacher, trying to teach a group of seventh graders who probably didn't even want to be there, certainly not on Zoom, and some of whom were autistic, is very, very challenging. So I first want to say no one is blaming the teachers. The teachers have worked very hard. Some of them don't even agree with this curriculum. And I want to give a shout out to them and say, we love you, teachers. We understand that. Now, we also need to understand that there is curriculum that is inappropriate. And we know that parents should be involved in knowing what their kids are being taught. And so we have to look at some transparency in the school so that parents do have access to their students' curriculum. And really, not being an education expert, I think if I got any deeper into it than that, I'd be in over my head. So I will stop there.
Well, that's very good. No, I certainly agree. There are many issues that plague the public schools, and we do have many good teachers. And but let me go on. After the School Boards Association warned Attorney General Merrick Garland about angry parents attending school board meetings, it was reported that the FBI overflew school board meetings with helicopters, apparently in an effort to intimidate people gathering for those meetings. And I understand from talking with some of the activists that indeed they had some success in causing people, many of whom are federal employees themselves, to say, wait a minute, okay, if the FBI is starting to observe us from the air, perhaps photograph people, maybe that puts me at risk as a federal employee.
Yeah.
And so now I can't swear to the accuracy of the FBI helicopters overflying, but there were a whole lot of people who reported that. And so I certainly wouldn't discount it.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do know that right here in Loudoun County, we had school members who were caught red-handed creating an enemies list of parents where they discussed online about how they should make sure that they destroy those parents' ability to make a living, get them fired from their jobs, take very severe punitive action against the parents for daring to speak out and to oppose the transgender ideology. Now, during the uproar over education, Democratic gubernatorial candidate Terry McAuliffe made the comment. He said he didn't think that parents should tell schools what to teach their children. That viewpoint and being so forthright about it may very well have finally cost him the election.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that parents should have a voice, or should education simply be left to the teachers' unions?
I love this question because the answer is not only should parents have a voice, but parents do have a voice. Every study shows that the parent is the most influential person in a child's life. So a parent has influence and a voice in their own child's life, but parents have another voice, and that's at the ballot box. And I love that this is your last question because I think this is a wonderful place to end, to say to parents, find out what's in your children's school. Go on to the Loudoun County School Board website, Loudoun County School website if you live in Loudoun County. There's a card catalog that's online. Look up your own school, see what's in there. I've mentioned a couple of books today. Look to see if those are in your kids' schools. If they are, and I guarantee you that they are because there's hundreds of books like this, find out who's running. All of our Loudoun County School Board members are up for election right now. Find out who they are. Find out who's running in your district. Find out who's running for Board of Supervisors. The Board of Supervisors funds the school that funds the books that go into these libraries. Find out who those candidates are. Find out who your House of Delegates and Senate senators are running, candidates running for our General Assembly. They're the ones who can enact legislation that can address the guardrails that I'm talking about. And ask these candidates what their views are on these books. What I would like to hear them say is that they understand that there's two sides to the coin. They understand the legitimacy of the argument on both sides of the coin, but that certain guardrails need to be put in place to protect the children who are not ready for these books. And those guardrails will enable parents to have the right to decide for themselves when their children can and if their children can see these books. So find out who gives you that type of an answer and go out and vote. And that's all I have to say on that.
Well, Laura Robinson, you have been delightful as a guest this morning. And I'm really so grateful to parents like you and so many others here in Loudoun County and across the nation, in other countries also, who are fighting to restore normalcy, decency, and traditional learning to our public schools. The children deserve it. They shouldn't be used as pawns in these ideological drives to change sexual behavior, to create racial divisions among people. So thank you very much for coming on, and thank you for the work that you are doing here in Loudoun County.
Thank you, Senator Black, and thank you for your support.
Okay, now we're going to shift gears, and many of you have been watching with great interest the developments that have been happening in Russia. And this is I'm speaking as Colonel Black at this point, and this is my assessment of the attempted coup in Russia. Many of you know that I have a military background. I fought with the Marines in Vietnam, both in the air as a helicopter pilot and on the ground as a forward air controller with the 1st Marine Division. And I was on 70 combat patrols, many of them very bloody, some of them the most fierce fighting of the entire Vietnam War. So I do have that background, and I am a very close student of military and political affairs, and have been since about the time I was 8 years old. So let me just present to you my analysis of what has happened in Russia over the last couple of days. On June the 23rd, Yevgeny Prigozhin led an attempted coup against the elected government of Russia. He seized the Russian military headquarters at Rostov-on-Don. Prigozhin is a mercurial narcissist who constantly denigrates the Russian army in order to magnify his own accomplishments. His Wagner group is a mercenary force augmented by a large number of criminals who were released from prisons to fight in the Ukraine war. Prigozhin fights for money, not patriotism. He has been a major headache for Moscow since early in the war. Now, with vital help from the Russian army, Prigozhin led the attack that drove Ukraine from Bakhmut, scoring perhaps the biggest victory in Europe since World War II. Now, this made him so popular that he was able to flex his muscles, and he began disparaging Russian soldiers and the general staff. He was an erratic gadfly, and he seriously undermined Russian unity of command. Now, the Russian army came to despise him for belittling their own heroic sacrifices that they had made. Now, we all know that the Ukrainian army has fought very heroically. We're not so often informed that the Russian army is fighting very heroically. I just mentioned that Prigozhin once called for Russia to be transformed into a North Korean-style dictatorship. He is known for imposing discipline by executing men, by hitting them and crushing their skulls with sledgehammers. And he does this to instill fear in members of his command. Very brutal person who does things that could not be done by Russian troops because they function under sort of a rule of law and order, whereas his people are contractors, and under whatever governs them, he's able to pretty much be an absolute dictator and execute people that he feels should be executed. So the army did come to despise him for belittling them. And what happened then is there was a struggle. Now, Prigozhin complained during the battle for Bakhmut that he was not receiving enough artillery ammunition. What was happening is that the high command was building new brigades, quite a number of them, and equipping them with tanks, with weapons, and with artillery rounds. So the available supply had to be distributed. But I can somewhat sympathize to him in the midst of the battle for going public and saying that he was not getting the artillery ammunition that he needed for the battle. But he went beyond that, and he found it necessary to sort of build himself up by belittling the sacrifices of others. And this is the reason that he was so widely disliked in the Russian army. So what happens is the high command, once the battle for Bakhmut was won, they began to sideline Prigozhin and the Wagner group. And he was not involved at all in this defense against the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Now, the Ukrainian counteroffensive was widely predicted to sweep the Russian troops off the field of battle and have a victorious drive that perhaps would then cross the border and head towards Moscow. This, of course, has not happened. But in any event, this was a very important battle. In this case, Russia on the defense, defending against the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Well, the counteroffensive has failed. Western media have been very disappointed, and they've repeatedly been saying that it's ground to a halt, or that its progress is slow, or that it is disappointing. These are major outlets that are saying this. So the counteroffensive has failed, at least up to this point, and it's failed because of the masterfully constructed Russian defenses, because of the superb fighting skill of troops who are now much better trained. They've had some time to undergo very thorough training. And also, Russia has done a masterful job of integrating all of their combat arms, their intelligence, their air control, the use of their air forces, just a whole array of battlefield intelligence and so forth they really have become a very, very effective fighting force. Now, so with the Russian army on the verge of potentially an enormous victory over Ukraine, perhaps even the decisive battle of the war, it left Prigozhin out of the spotlight and risked a steady erosion of his power and popularity. So with time slipping away, Prigozhin felt he had to act quickly. He tried to convince the leadership of the Wagner Group to follow him, ostensibly in some sort of a quest for justice against certain generals in Moscow. He had a grudge match against some of them, and he said this was a quest for justice. We've got to march, and we've got to ensure that we're respected and remove these generals. So apparently, most of the officers in the Wagner Group declined to join this effort, but quite a number of the enlisted troops did follow him. But even with that, at the upper end, it seems that only about half of the Wagner Group actually followed Prigozhin in his march towards Russia. And you have to realize that even now, we could be talking about 10, 15,000 at the most. So, and realize, Moscow is a city of millions of people. So, 10 or 15,000 people simply get lost on the streets of Moscow. They wouldn't even know where they were headed. And they would sort of blend in with the crowd where people would hardly notice them. But anyway, with this smaller force, now keep in mind, at one time, Prigozhin led a force of up to 50,000 people in the battle for Bakhmut. By the end of the battle, due to casualties and also people finishing up their contracts and going home, he was down to 25,000. So now he tries to get these people to make this drive on this quest for justice towards Moscow, and about half of those, so somewhere between 10 and 15,000, start on this effort. But keep in mind, only a very small number of the Wagner leaders even had a real understanding of where they were headed. Some of them thought that they were being redeployed to another point in Russia to defend it against some of these cross-border attacks that Ukraine had been launching. So many of them just thought they were doing their patriotic duty, not to Prigozhin, but to the Russian government and the Russian people. So there were only a few of the key leaders who knew where they were headed and who kind of understood that the ultimate goal, if this thing succeeded, might very well evolve into a coup to overthrow President Putin himself and the Duma and the entire government. So what happened as the day wore on, the Russian High Command launched fairly serious air attacks to deter Prigozhin. He was moving along on superhighways, right out in public, had armored vehicles and personnel carriers and things like that, and he's rolling on the road headed towards Moscow. So this air attack hits, and they start attacking the column. During that, Prigozhin somehow managed to down a number of Russian aircraft and to kill the crew. And these were men killed by these Wagner Group people. Now, Here's the thing. Prigozhin hoped that his ranks would swell with citizens, with public officials, with the media, as they moved towards Moscow. Now, I've personally watched this happen. I made several trips to Cuba during the Cuban Revolution. Now, two of them were before the revolution. One was following the revolution. And we actually, my father was with Internal Revenue Service, and he was responsible for the audits of the major American businesses in Havana. And so he would take me with him when he went. And so I followed with great intensity what was going on, because I was begging my father. I said, "Oh, let's don't wait until the revolution's over. Let's go. I want to watch this thing unfold." And he was a little more mature. I was just a little boy, and he said, "No." He said, "We're going to bide our time. We'll wait." But then we went afterwards. But what I saw is the Revolutionary Army came out of the hills. I think it was Sierra Maestro, they called them. Anyway, I may have that name a little off. It's been a long time. 1959 was the revolution. But anyway, it started as a relatively small, hardcore band. But as they marched towards Havana, it swelled, it grew. They felt like, okay, we're going to win. We want to be part of the winning side. Peasants started joining in. And by the time that they reached Havana, there was this massive gaggle of humanity who were, supposedly part of this revolutionary army. This is the way that a successful revolution works. But in this case, Prigozhin was hoping that his ranks would swell just as Fidel Castro's had. But the further he went, he began to see that no one was joining. No one can. The public didn't rush out to say, "Oh, let me jump aboard one of these personnel carriers and I'll ride victoriously into Moscow." Nobody did that. No army units defected and came over. So here's what happened. After the battle with the Russian air forces, the Wagner troops began to realize that something was terribly wrong. Why is the Russian Air Force attacking us? Aren't we supposed to be helping to defend part of Russia? So it began to sink in. Okay, this is not what we were taught that it was. And then finally, President Putin came out and he went on the air to denounce the putsch. At that point, Prigozhin's forces began to realize, oh, wait a minute, we're the enemy. We're not allies of Russia. We are the enemy. And at that point, his forces began to panic and to dissipate. And so instead of the force swelling as it approached Moscow, Prigozhin's force withered, leaving him weak and imperiled. Already, the Federal Security Service, essentially the equivalent of the FBI in our country, the FSS had conducted raids on Prigozhin's headquarters and seized 1 billion rubles in cash. Billboards that advertised the Wagner Group all over the country were already literally in the midst of the first day of the coup. The big billboard panels were being torn down all across Russia, and all signs of Wagner Group were starting to disappear. Now, it was important that President Putin early on was supported by President Erdogan of Turkey. And this was important because Turkey, historically, they like to keep a posture of diplomatic ambiguity and uncertainty. It's worked very well for Turkey for many years. But President Erdogan felt threatened by the potential overthrow of Putin, and he was much more forward than usual in his support. So Turkey came in fairly strongly behind President Putin. China, which is very, very below the radar with their diplomacy, still made it clear that they maintained their support for President Putin remaining in power. And it's interesting that Americans don't realize a great portion of the world is very much against the war in Ukraine. They're against NATO's side in the war. And none of President Putin's international support ever diminished in the slightest. So at this point, with the drive on Moscow withered to where you have this small number of people with Prigozhin out, in the hinterlands, President Putin of Russia asked Alexander Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, to negotiate an end to the standoff. Putin was wise enough, the government was wise enough to offer Prigozhin, who was sort of a megalomaniac. He just, I should, but he's a narcissist. That's really what I'm trying to say. He wanted to give him a way out. He wanted to give the man an open door to walk through. And so Lukashenko negotiated with Prigozhin for a standoff, and left with nowhere to hide, Prigozhin agreed that he would leave his troops and fly off to Belarus. Now, Belarus is a separate country, but their alliance with Russia is extraordinarily close. The Army High Command of Belarus answers to the Russian army. So they are almost a blend of one and the same, somewhat the same way that National Guard troops in a state in the United States answer to the Pentagon, even though they also answer to the governor of the state. It's a very similar relationship. But in any event, when they say Prigozhin has flown off to Belarus, if you think that Prigozhin is going to be some freewheeling agent who can create trouble from Belarus, you probably do not understand the reality of Belarus. Now, Prigozhin was promised that he would not be prosecuted for treason, but it's unclear exactly what his fate will be. The Russian High Command said that for those members of the Wagner Group that had not participated directly in planning the coup and being involved, that many of those would be integrated into the Russian army. And so it's not exactly clear what will be the fate of some of the leaders of the Wagner Group, particularly those who managed to shoot down some of the Russian helicopters and intelligence aircraft that were downed during their advance. I have a feeling that the death penalty awaits some of those people. So after a very dramatic day, the mutiny was over. Within a single day, it was over. The reputation of the Wagner Group has been seriously damaged. Its troops will be distributed. I suspect that the Wagner Group as an entity will disappear over the near term. So meanwhile, now while all of this is unfolding, I mean, I don't believe that this was something that was instigated necessarily by the West. Prigozhin may have had contacts with spies on behalf of NATO. I don't know that. It wouldn't surprise me. He responded to money. He liked money, but at the same time, he was not beloved in the West either. But while all of this is going on, the Russian army has continued its very successful defense against the Ukrainian counterattack. No advantage accrued to President Zelensky of Ukraine. And it wasn't so much Zelensky's fault. He was encouraged by some of the retired military generals. I saw one who appeared on Fox News and said, okay, this is the time, get them while they're down. Now that there's this disruption, this would be the time for Ukraine to attack and to overwhelm the disorganized Russian forces. Well, the fact is that the Russian forces were never disrupted. I would be a little surprised if most of them even realized that there was a coup attempt underway. They're not just sitting on their hunches listening to broadcasts on the radio. They're out in the field, and it's very dangerous. If you communicate by cell phone, as soon as you pick up that phone and say, hello, Mom, what's happening in Moscow? An artillery round is going to land on your head because all of these are intercepted. And so you don't have good communications on the battlefield. So my guess is that very few of the troops fighting were even aware of what was happening. So what happened is the Russian army continued its very successful defense against Ukraine, no advantage to Zelensky, and there was simply no time for Ukraine to react, even if they had wanted to do so. Let me say that it's my opinion that the Western reports that Putin was politically damaged are greatly overblown. Putin remains firmly in control. The Russian officials, I'm talking about all of the political leadership across the country, rushed to his defense. The army remained totally loyal to him and to their entire chain of command. Prigozhin managed to capture 2 of the Russian generals. He appeared on television somewhere with them, and both of them really handled themselves pretty respectably, considering the fact that this is a man who executes people by slamming them on the head with sledgehammers. They talked with him, but they held their ground and challenged him on what he was doing. Why are you doing this? So there were no reports whatsoever of Russian defections. The media stood solidly behind President Putin throughout this event. And even social media generally came behind him, although I did read of one low-level exception where there was an individual who said the time is right, let's do this and that. But that really was the exception that proved the rule. Not a single of Russia's allied nations withdrew support or displayed any sort of hesitancy. So Prigozhin's revolt ended in a single day. This was a man, now you have to, I don't want to belittle Prigozhin, because Prigozhin he spoke with an enormously powerful voice within Russia. He had tremendous personal popularity, kind of like a rock star would or something. He had enormous notoriety. In addition to that, he had a very powerful, battle-hardened military force at his disposal. So you think about this. If Prigozhin, with all of those advantages, could not pull off a coup, then no one can. I predict that it will be many years, decades perhaps, before anyone even thinks about making such a desperate gambit again. So it is my assessment that President Putin's position within Russia will be considerably strengthened as a result of this, and not weakened at all. I'd like to mention, this has been a fascinating couple of days. Prigozhin's mutiny is very reminiscent of General Benedict Arnold, who during the Revolutionary War was a brilliant, highly respected revolutionary commander. But what happened with Benedict Arnold is that he did not get the spotlight after he was very victorious in battle, very personally heroic. The spotlight left him. And as a result, his personal jealousy caused him to betray his countrymen and join the British ranks during the war. Now, in exchange for joining the British, Benedict Arnold was made a brigadier general in the British Armed Forces. So after the colonists tried to execute him, he managed to escape very dramatically, and he fled to England, expecting a hero's welcome. But the problem was that the British viewed him as a traitor to his cause. Even though the British had been fighting and dying to suppress the American Revolution, they really had a very low regard for people who were traitors to their own people. As a result of this, Benedict Arnold struggled for the rest of his life. He lived there in England, and he died there, a man reviled by both sides that fought the war. The British hated him, the Americans hated him. And so perhaps that fate, or worse, is what awaits Mr. Prigozhin and his lieutenants in this attempted coup. So that is my assessment. I thank you for listening. This has been Focus on the News. I'm Colonel Dick Black, Senator Black, and we will see you next Monday at 11.